Welcome to Beyond the Shadows, where darkness whispers and chilling tales come to life. On this channel, we dive deep into the unknown, unraveling ghostly encounters, haunting mysteries, and eerie legends that send shivers down your spine. Tonight, we bring you the chilling tale Bewitched. Crafted by the imaginative mind of Edith Wharton, prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows, where every word lingers, and every silence echoes with the unknown. Turn down the lights, settle in, and let the story begin. The snow was still falling thickly when Orrin Bosworth, who farmed the land south of Lone Top, drove up in his cutter to Saul Rutledge's gate. He was surprised to see two other cutters ahead of him. From them descended two muffled figures. Bosworth, with increasing surprise, recognized Deacon Hibben from North Ashmore, and Sylvester Brand, the widower, from the old Birkliff farm on the way to Lone Top. It was not often that anybody in Hemlock County entered Saul Rutledge's gate, least of all in the dead of winter, and summoned as Bosworth, at any rate, had been by Mrs. Rutledge, who passed, even in that unsocial region, for a woman of cold manners and solitary character. The situation was enough to excite the curiosity of a less imaginative man than Orrin Bosworth, as he drove in between the broken-down white gate posts topped by fluted urns. The two men ahead of him were leading their horses to the adjoining shed. Bosworth followed and hitched his horse to a post. Then the three tossed off the snow from their shoulders, clapped their numb hands together, and greeted each other. "Hello, Deacon." Well, Orrin, they shook hands. "Day," Bosworth said. Sylvester Brand, with a brief nod. He seldom put any cordiality into his manner, and on this occasion he was still busy about his horse's bridle and blanket. Orrin Bosworth, the youngest and most communicative of the three, turned back to Deacon Hibben, whose long face, queerly blotched and moldy-looking, with blinking peering eyes, was yet less forbidding than Brand's heavily hewn countenance. "Queer. Are all meeting here this way?" "Mrs. Rutledge sent me a message to come," Bosworth volunteered. The deacon nodded. "I got a word from her to Andy Pond come with it yesterday noon. I hope there's no trouble here." He glanced through the thickening fall of snow at the desolate front of the Rutledge house, the more melancholy in its present neglected state because, like the gate posts, it kept traces of former elegance. Bosworth had often wondered how such a house had come to be built in that lonely stretch between North Ashmore and Cold Corners. People said there had once been other houses like it, forming a little township called Ashmore, a sort of mountain colony created by the caprice of an English royalist officer, one Colonel Ashmore, who had been murdered by the Indians, with all his family, long before the Revolution. This tale was confirmed by the fact that the ruined cellars of several smaller houses were still to be discovered under the wild growth of the adjoining slopes, and that the communion plate of the moribund Episcopal Church of Cold Corners was engraved with the name of Colonel Ashmore, who had given it to the Church of Ashmore in the year 1723. Of the church itself no traces remained. Doubtless it had been a modest wooden edifice, built on piles, and the conflagration which had burnt the other houses to the ground's edge had reduced it utterly to ashes. The whole place, even in summer, wore a mournful solitary air, and people wondered why Saul Rutledge's father had gone there to settle. "I never knew a place," Deacon Hibben said, "as seemed as far away from humanity. And yet it ain't so in miles." "Miles ain't the only distance," Orrin Bosworth answered, and the two men, followed by Sylvester Brand, walked across the drive to the front door. People in Hemlock County did not usually come and go by their front doors. But all three men seemed to feel that, on an occasion which appeared to be so exceptional, the usual and more familiar approach by the kitchen would not be suitable. He groped his way across the threshold, caught a sharp splinter of the fallen door in his palm. Maybe. And a cry. Bran had turned back, and was staggering past him out into the lingering daylight. Bosworth followed him, suddenly flushing through the trees. They had judged rightly. He bent his head to examine his weapon. "They shan't dig her up now," he shouted out. And Bosworth got the revolver away from him. The next day Bosworth's sister Loretta, when he came in for his midday dinner, if he had heard the news, Bosworth had been sawing wood all the morning. The deacon had hardly lifted the knocker when the door opened and Mrs. Vinnie Brand's down sick with pneumonia. "I guess she's dying. Miles away. You never liked her." "She's a child. I never knew much about her." "Well," repeated his sister. Rutledge stood before them, with the guileless relish of the unimaginative for bad news. "I guess she's dying." After a pause, she added, "It'll kill Sylvester Brand." Bosworth got up and said, "I've got to see to poulticing the Gray's fetlock." He walked out into the steadily falling snow. Vinnie Brand was buried 3 days later. Bosworth was one of the pallbearers. The whole countryside turned out, for the snow had stopped falling. After all, so suddenly, had the fascination of tragedy. They say her lungs filled right up ... Seems she had bronchial troubles before ... I always said both them girls was frail ... Look at Aura, too. She pined away just the same. They don't ever make old bones on the mother's side of the family ... Their single quotes s that young Bedloe over there. They say Vinnie was engaged to him ... Oh. There's a seat for you alongside of Grandma ... Excuse me ... Step right into the pew. Walk right in, she said in her usual dead-level tone. A monumental structure, which no one had seen out of her trunk since old Mrs. Silsey's funeral, 3 years before. All the women remembered it. Under its perpendicular pile her narrow face, swaying on the long thin neck, seemed whiter than ever, but her air of fretfulness had been composed into a suitable expression of mournful immobility. And Bosworth looks as if the stonemason had carved her to put atop of Vinnie's grave, Bosworth thought as she glided past him, and then shivered at his own sepulchral fancy. When she bent over her hymn book, her lowered lids reminded him again of marble eyeballs. The bony hands clasping the book were bloodless. The coffin of Vinnie Brand had been lowered into her sister's grave, and the neighbors were slowly dispersing, as pallbearer, as he followed the others. He waited till Brand had turned from the grave with the deacon at his side. The 3 men stood together for a moment. Brand's face was the closed door of a vault, barred with wrinkles like bands of iron. Brand nodded and turned away toward the shed where the horses were hitched. "Let me drive along home with you," he suggested. Brand did not so much as turn his head, and the other fell back. "Your daughter Aura," a few feet off, Rutledge's tall bonnet lording it above the group, and he pawned, was backing out the sleigh. "Who kept house for him?" "Rutledge." "Is he?" one of the village elders piped, so that when she dropped them her rather prominent eyes looked like the sightless orbs of a marble statue. Thought to himself, Rutledge's marble face. Bosworth heard her measure out her answer in slow, incisive words. "No! He would have come for certain, but his Aunt Minorca Cummins is being buried down to Stotesbury this very day, and he had to go down there. Don't it sometimes seem as if we was all walking right in the shadow of death?" As she walked toward the cutter, in which Andy Pond was already seated. "Whatever's happened," and lifted the lids of marble. "Yes. I guess he'll sleep quieter now, and her too. Now she don't lay there alone any longer," she added in a low voice. She got into the cutter and said in a clear tone to Andy Pond, "As long as we're down here, I don't know but what I'll just call round and get a box of soap at Hiram Pringle's. She's not going to let it show in her face." And Bosworth's first thought was that he looked like a drowned man fished out from under the ice. "Self-drowned," he added. It was doubtful. Indeed, if anything unwanted could be made to show in Prudence Rutledge's face, the shortest way to the forge passed close by Lamer's Pond, so fixed were its features. Sol ain't here today. She was dressed for the occasion in a black calico with white spots, and a gray woolen shawl crossed under her arms and tied at the back. The oppressive weight of the next question to be asked. In her small narrow head the only marked prominence was that of the brow projecting roundly over pale spectacled eyes. "Mrs." parted above this prominence, and her contracted head looked still narrower from being perched on a long hollow neck with cord-like throat muscles. Her eyes were of a pale cold gray. Her age might have been anywhere from 35 to 60. The room into which she led the three men had probably been the dining room of the Ashmore house. The other did not seem to hear him, and a black stove planted on a sheet of zinc stuck out from the delicately fluted panels of an old wooden mantel, and the room was at once close and bitterly cold. "Andy Pond, Mrs." Rutledge cried to someone at the back of the house. To his surprise, it had resumed a natural imperturbable expression, as the deacon said, "Mrs. Step out and call Mr. Rutledge. You'll likely find him in the woodshed, or round the barn somewheres," she rejoined her visitors. The three men took the chairs she pointed out. "And Mrs. Who do you mean by her?" he asked abruptly. Behind a rickety beadwork table, she glanced from one to the other of her visitors. They got into the sleigh and drove on, as Bosworth waited for her. The sun set. "I presume you folks are wondering what it is I asked you to come here for," she said in her dead-level voice. Orrin Bosworth and Deacon Hibben murmured an assent. Sylvester Brand sat silent, his eyes, under their great thicket of eyebrows, fixed on the huge boot tip swinging before him. "I allow you didn't expect it was for a party," continued Mrs. Rutledge, and she continued, "We're in trouble here, and we need advice, Mr. Mrs. Rutledge and myself do." She cleared her throat. The two men caught him by the arms, her pitilessly clear eyes looking straight before her. There's a spell been cast over Mr. Rutledge. He was younger than any of them. The deacon looked up sharply, an incredulous smile pinching his thin lips. "That's what I said, he's bewitched." Again the three visitors were silent. And at any season a funeral offered an opportunity for an outing that was not to be missed. Then Bosworth, more at ease or less tongue-tied than the others, asked with an attempt at humor, "Do you use the word in the strict scripture sense? Better here than in the churchyard?" "Rutledge." What more could they ask? She glanced at him before replying, "That's how he uses it." She turned her small head on her rigid neck. The deacon coughed and cleared his long, rattling throat. "Do you care to give us more particulars before your husband joins us?" She just drew me ... "Mrs." His silence fell. As if considering the question, Bosworth noticed that the inner fold of her lids was of the same uniform white as the rest of her skin. Bran said nothing. The impression was unpleasing. Gave the horse a cut across the flanks, and he glanced away at the text over the mantelpiece, which read, "The soul that sinneth it shall die." I'll wait. At this moment, Sylvester Brand suddenly stood up and pushed back his chair. In his rough bass voice, "Him and the dead? As I've got any particular lights on Bible mysteries." Rutledge ... he spoke in a low automatic tone. "Mrs." With an increasing air of constraint. Rutledge lifted one of her long thin hands. Her complexion was an even white, withered and wrinkled by hard work and cold. It was nevertheless of the same leaden white as her face. He tried to dissipate the sensation by speaking with an affectation of energy. "You won't be kept long," she said. "Won't you be seated?" Farmer Brand stood irresolute, his purplish underlip twitching. "The deacon here, such things is more in his line ... I want you should say," said Mrs. "That's what cured him." Rutledge quietly, and Brand sat down again, during which the 4 persons present seemed all to be listening for the sound of a step. And after a minute or two Mrs. Rutledge began to speak again. "It's down by that old shack on Lamer's Pond." Saul Rutledge nodded. The deacon went up to her with visible hesitation. "That's where they meet," she said suddenly. "Bosworth." Whose eyes were on Sylvester Brand's face. She looked coldly at her questioner. Deacon Hibben leaned forward. Rutledge made a faint motion of assent, a glitter of curiosity in his eyes. "They who?" And then hastened on to the deserted hovel. "Mrs. My husband." Saul Rutledge ... and her ... Sylvester Brand again stirred in his seat, as if roused out of some far-off musing. Mrs. Rutledge's body did not move. Turned in the direction of the house by the pond, she simply revolved her head on her long neck and looked at him. "Your daughter. They do walk." Sylvester Brand. The man staggered to his feet with an explosion of inarticulate sounds. "Drew you down to that abandoned house by the pond? My daughter? What the hell are you talking about? My daughter?" "Mr. Brand," said Mrs. Rutledge slowly, and they rested on the mildewed countenance of Deacon Hibben. Down that very slope. Between the blotches it had become as white as Mrs. Rutledge is. If he didn't. "Please," he interjected. Brand gave a laugh, the rusty creaking laugh of one whose springs of mirth are never moved by gaiety. "My daughter Aura," he repeated. "Yes." The deacon's hand again checked him. "That's what he says." "That's what Mr. Rutledge says." Orrin Bosworth listened with a sense of suffocation. "Rutledge!" He felt as if he were wrestling with long-armed horrors in a dream. He could no longer resist letting his eyes return to Sylvester Brand's face. "Is that all?" he queried contemptuously. "What did she say?" "Ain't it enough?" Rutledge interjected. "How long is it since you folks seen Saul Rutledge?" "Any of you, Mrs. Rutledge flew out at them. Bosworth, it appeared, had not seen him for nearly a year. The deacon had only run across him once, for a minute, at the North Ashmore post office, the previous autumn, and acknowledged that he wasn't looking any too good then, but stood irresolute. If you wait a minute you'll see with your own eyes." and he'll tell you with his own words. That's what I've got you here for, to see for yourselves what's come over him. And when she was dead, she'd come back to me. Then you'll talk different, she added, twisting her head abruptly toward Sylvester Brand. Vinnie Brand was young and handsome, at least some people thought her handsome. The deacon raised a lean hand of interrogation. Does your husband know we've been sent for on this business? Rutledge misses. With his curiously clear, unseeing gaze, well, he said. Rutledge signed assent. Then, I guess it had to be, she said. Can you tell us? Or rather, like a sick man before the physicians who were to heal him. Mrs. So when under the dark sunburn, Rutledge. How this trouble you speak of shows itself ... What makes you think? Seemed to see something white and wraith-like surge up out of the darkest corner of the hut. She looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned forward across the rickety beadwork table. Often? I don't think I know. Besides. Well, but how? She leaned closer. Ain't it? Both elbows on the table. Bosworth looked at her with listless eyes. I seen him. In the ashen light from the veiling of snow beyond the windows, the deacon's little screwed-up eyes seemed to give out red sparks. How can he explain? Him and the dead. No! Saul Rutledge and Ora Brand? That's so! Sylvester Brand's chair fell backward with a crash. It's his brain that's sick. He was on his feet again. Here. Let me get out of this. She just draws you? I want to see Saul Rutledge himself. And tell him. Well, Rutledge. The outer door had opened. They heard the familiar stamping and shaking of a man who rids his garments of their last snowflakes before penetrating to the sacred precincts of the best parlor. Then Saul Rutledge entered. Rutledge seemed to consider. As he came in, he faced the light from the north window. It must have been partly that, Bosworth reflected, which transformed Saul Rutledge from the straight muscular fellow he had been a year before into the haggard wretch now before them. The deacon sought for a word to ease the horror. The service was over, and meeting with an unexpected resistance. We're Mrs. Well, Brand turned to the door. As you said, had a touch of ague. Maybe. The feeble attempt was unavailing. Rutledge neither moved nor answered. Rutledge! He stood among them silent, and added in a lower tone, and between times he labored hard on his stony acres and did his best for his daughters. Incommunicable, like one risen from the dead. Brand grasped him roughly by the shoulder. Saul Rutledge! A mere lane under steep bushy banks. What's this dirty lie your wife tells us you've been putting about? Bosworth said nothing. Still Rutledge did not move. It's no lie, he said. Her dark hair. Brand's hand dropped from his shoulder. In spite of the man's rough bullying power, he seemed to be undefinably awed by Rutledge's look and tone. No lie? And then heard a revolver shot at his elbow. You've gone plumb crazy. Well, I presume you want this business settled too? Then, have you? Mrs. My husband's not lying. Nor he ain't gone crazy. Don't I tell you I seen him? Brand laughed again. But the snowlight plays cruel tricks with a man's color. Him and the dead? Yes. Down by the Lamer Pond, you say? Yes. And when was that, if I might ask? Mrs. Day before yesterday. God. As silence fell on the strangely assembled group, the deacon at length broke it to say to Mr. Brand, in my opinion, we've got to see this thing through. Brand stood for a moment in speechless contemplation. There was something animal and primitive about him, Bosworth thought, as he hung thus, lowering and dumb, a little foam beating the corners of that heavy purplish underlip. The door collapsed like a playing card. He let himself slowly down into his chair, crimson and cursing. I'll see it through. The two other men and Mrs. Saul Rutledge stood before them. And this happens to be the day I was to go down to Starkfield to close a deal with a man. He tethered his own horse near Brand's, like a prisoner at the bar. He heard the deacon say, I'm glad to hear that Saul is able to be up and around. As Bosworth scrutinized that hollow face, so sucked inward and consumed by some hidden fever, husband and wife spoke the truth, and that they were all at that moment really standing on the edge of some forbidden mystery. Rutledge almost screamed. Brand lifted up his brooding head. Things that the rational mind would reject without a thought seemed no longer so easy to dispose of as one looked at the actual Saul Rutledge and remembered the man he had been a year before. And that's the fact. Yes. They would have to see it through. Sit down then. Saul! Won't you, the deacon suggested. Draw up to us. And sat looking through pine trunks purpled by the sunset at the crumbling structure. Mrs. Rutledge pushed a chair forward, and her husband sat down on it. He stretched out his arms and grasped his knees in his brown bony fingers. In that attitude he remained, turning neither his head nor his eyes. It was with his consent. Saul, the deacon continued. Your wife says you thought maybe we could do something to help you through this trouble. Will you try and give us your idea of how it began? He scrambled into his sleigh, and Cressidora's calm face suddenly became a coil of twitching features. Perhaps it was for that very reason that he had left his cutter and vanished in the direction of the house. Whatever it is. No, she said at length. Rutledge's gray eyes widened a little. Head, I didn't think that. For the first time, though, since you've agreed to our coming, that you don't object to our putting a few questions? Rutledge sat stiffly down upon a fourth. It was now used as a front parlor. Rutledge was silent for a moment. The Rutledge farm hand. There stole over the sound healthy man the thought that perhaps. Then he said with a visible effort, no. Bosworth's resources had failed him. What news? Rutledge made a slight motion of assent. And what have you got to answer? How do you explain? Rutledge intervened. I seen him. Venny Brand, he echoed. There was a silence. In the autumn. Trying to speak in an easy, reassuring tone. Queried, that so? Saul? Passed tight and fiat over the tips of her ears into a small braided coil at the nape. You mean to say you you sit here before us all and say, belabored on ahead through the pines. Hold on. I don't object. Friend Brand, we're all of us trying for the facts. Here he is, said Mrs. Ain't we? He turned to Rutledge. It was empty. We've heard what Mrs. Rutledge says. I don't know as there's any answer. Loretta Bosworth was talking with the other women while the men unblanketed their horses and backed the cutters out into the heavy snow. And you mean to tell me the person with you was ... was what you took to be ... double quotes the deacon's thin voice grew thinner, or a brand? You knew ... or thought you knew ... you were meeting with the dead? Rutledge bent his head again, and Bosworth felt as if a winding sheet were descending from the sky to envelop them all in a common grave. Think what you're saying. Or a ... poor child, died over a year ago. I saw you at her funeral. Saul! Then tomorrow. How can you make such a statement? What else can he do? Thrust in Mrs. Rutledge. There was another pause. That's so. And Brand once more sat plunged in dark meditation. What's your answer? And moistened his lips. Was the day before yesterday the first time? He asked. Not the first. Then when ... Nigh on a year ago, I reckon. And you mean to tell us that ever since? Well ... look at him, said his wife. The three men lowered their eyes. After a moment Bosworth glanced at the deacon. If that's what we're here for? That's so, the deacon assented. He turned to Rutledge. So limited was its scope. There was another silence. Then Rutledge tightened his grasp on his gaunt knees. The deacon read the service. Was the proof the deacon had asked for. They held it. And still looking straight ahead. For even I was married to Mrs. As if some invisible agent were dictating his words. Or even uttering them for him. There was a long pause. You know, he added, Ora and me was to have been married. Sylvester Brand lifted his. Straightened that statement out first. What I mean is, we kept company. But Ora, she was very young. She was gone nigh to 3 years. A thin smile of disdain narrowed her colorless lips. I guess. Though she was so swarthy and her dying like that. Trying to collect himself. That's right, Brand said, relapsing once more into his sunken attitude. And after she came back, did you meet her again? The deacon continued. Alive, Rutledge questioned. A perceptible shudder ran through the room. Well, of course, said the deacon nervously. Mrs. Once I did, only once. There was a lot of other people round. Only a minute. His voice dropped. She said she was sick and knew she was going to die. And what did you answer? Nothing. Felt obliged to linger and say a word to the stricken father. Did you think anything of it at the time? But there wasn't much to be got out of those barren Birkliff acres. To break the silence. Well, no! Not till I heard she was dead. I didn't. After his parents died. After that I thought of it and I guess she drew me. He moistened his lips. And the deacon added, how did you know it was there she wanted you to come? Bosworth felt. But if it's always there she draws you. On himself and the other two men. Deacon Hibben held up his hand. And his eyes wandered to the window. Mrs. Rutledge opened and closed her narrow lips once or twice. The two men looked at each other again. Like some beach shellfish gasping for the tide. Rutledge waited. Well. Now. Saul. Like a man getting over a fever. Won't you go on with what you was telling us? The deacon at length suggested. That's all. There's nothing else. The deacon lowered his voice. I'm agreeable, he said. That's as it happens ... Man, haven't you the strength to keep away from the place? Rutledge wearily turned his head toward his questioner. A spectral smile narrowed his colorless lips. Ain't any use. Rutledge intervened. The three men came out together in the cleared space before the house. Then and there, the deacon laid his quivering fingertips together. Rutledge's presence checked the next question. And in spite of the cold and the driving snow, the deacon seemed hopelessly to revolve the matter. At length he spoke in a more authoritative tone. Home, how she took and wasted away, and it's colder and all outdoors up there, to brand single quotes as ... their mother. These are forbidden things. You know that. Saul. Have you tried prayer? Rutledge shook his head. Rutledge cast a glance of freezing indifference on his spiritual advisor. If you folks want to pray. But Mrs. Her eyes filling. Prayer ain't any good. In this kind of thing it ain't no manner of use. Turning about their hats in reluctant hands. You know it ain't. I called you here. Because you remember the last case in this parish. 30 years ago it was, I guess. But you remember. Deacon. Lefitz Nash, did praying help him? And it's the only way. No one ventured to respond to this chill pleasantry. I was a little girl then. Involuntarily Bosworth also moved nearer. But I used to hear my folks talk of it winter nights. They drove a stake through her breast. Oh, Orrin Bosworth exclaimed. Sylvester Brand raised his head. You're speaking of that old story as if this was the same sort of thing? Ain't my husband pining away the same as Lefitz Nash did? Then it is ... the dead ... The deacon here knows. The deacon stirred anxiously in his chair. These are forbidden things, he repeated. Supposing your husband is quite sincere in thinking himself haunted. As you might say, well, what proof have we that the ... the dead woman ... is the specter of that poor girl? Proof? Don't he say so? And Vanessa and Ora were the handsomest girls anywhere around. Didn't she tell him? Then he said and began to laugh. Ain't I seen 'em, Mrs. The three men sat silent, turning a benevolent old tortoise head about on a loose neck. And suddenly the wife burst out, a stake through the breast, that's the old way. The deacon knows it. It's against our religion to disturb the dead. Putting the book on the table and moistening a livid fingertip, she turned the pages rapidly, till she came to one on which she laid her hand like a stony paperweight. It was her idea to try what could be done. See here, she said, and read out in her level chanting voice. Suddenly he gave an exclamation, look! And the deacon's eyes burned in the whiteness like live embers among ashes. That's in Exodus. That's where it is, she added. Leaving the book open, as if to confirm the statement, Bosworth continued to glance anxiously from one to the other of the four people about the table, and had more contact with the modern world. Down in Starkfield. Saw you looks if you'd ought to set right up to the stove. In the bar of the Fielding house, he could hear himself laughing with the rest of the men at such old wives' tales. But it was not for nothing that he had been born under the icy shadow of Lone Top, and had shivered and hungered as a lad through the bitter Hemlock County winters. And he had taken hold of the farm himself. He had got more out of it by using improved methods, and by supplying the increasing throng of summer boarders over Stotesbury Way with milk and vegetables. Well, he had been made a selectman of North Ashmore. For so young a man he had a standing in the county. The movement of Rutledge's head was negative, but the roots of the old life were still in him. As a little boy, going twice a year with his mother to that bleak hill farm out beyond Sylvester Brand's, Bosworth's aunt, Cressidora Cheney. They had only a few yards to walk to overtake him, had been shut up for years in a cold clean room with iron bars in the windows. When little Orrin first saw Aunt Cressidora, she was a small white old woman, whom her sisters used to make decent for visitors the day that Orrin and his mother were expected. The child wondered why there were bars to the window. Like a canary bird, he said to his mother. The phrase made Mrs. Bosworth reflect. I do believe they keep Aunt Cressidora to lonesome, she said. And the next time she went up the mountain with the little boy he carried to his great aunt, a canary in a little wooden cage. Orrin. It was a great excitement. The old woman's motionless face lit up when she saw the bird, and her eyes began to glitter. Leffitz, Nash, and Hannah Corey. All. It belongs to me, she said instantly, stretching her soft bony hand over the cage. Two. Of course it does. He stood still. And Cressy, said Mrs. Bosworth. He knew it would make her happy. Crimsoned his face like blood, startled by the shadow of the old woman's hand. At the sight. You she devil. You, she cried in a high squealing voice. And thrusting her hand into the cage, she dragged out the terrified bird and wrung its neck. She was plucking the hot body. Mrs. And squealing she devil, as they drew little Orrin from the room. What do you make of this business? On the way down the mountain his mother wept a great deal, and said, you must never tell anybody that poor Andy's crazy, or the men would come and take her down to the asylum at Starkfield, and the shame of it would kill us all. Now promise, the child promised. He remembered the scene now, with its deep fringe of mystery, secrecy, and rumor. Well, you've heard what your wife says? It seemed related to a great many other things below the surface of his thoughts. Didn't the summer folks still drive over in jolly buckboard loads to see the meeting house where the trial had been held? Making him feel that all the old people he had known, and who believed in these things, might after all be right. Hadn't a witch been burned at North Ashmore? Rutledge spoke. Bosworth was sure of it. Bosworth felt an icy chill down his spine. Why did people from all over the place come to him when their animals had queer sicknesses? Or when there was a child in the family that had to be kept shut up because it fell down flat and foamed? Yes. Proof that spooks walk, the other sneered. In spite of his religion, Deacon Hibben knew. And Brand? Well, it came to Bosworth in a flash. That North Ashmore woman who was burned had the name of Brand. The same stock. No doubt. There have been Brands in Hemlock County ever since the white men had come there. When he was a child, remembered hearing his parents say that Sylvester Brand hadn't ever oughter married his own cousin. Because of the blood. Too deep for thought. Yet the couple had had two healthy girls, and blinking up into Mrs. And when Mrs. Brand pined away and died, nobody suggested that anything had been wrong with her mind. Will you pray with us now? Brand knew it, I presume, and scrimped and saved all he could to send Aura, the eldest, down to Starkfield to learn bookkeeping. When she's married, I'll send you, he used to say to little Venny. In the biting outer air, who was his favorite? But Orrin never married. Instinctively he turned his eyes away from Brand. She was away 3 years. Then, fancied he saw a sort of inner flush darken the farmer's heavy leathern skin. In that lucid circle, during which Venny ran wild on the slopes of Lone Top. And when Ori came back she sickened and died, poor girl. Since then Brand had grown more savage and morose. He was a hard-working farmer. He was said to have taken to drink since his wife's death. Now and then men ran across him in the dives of Stotesbury. But not often. It's a goddamn fiend begotten lie ... which had begun again in the night. In the neglected graveyard of Cold Corners, there was a slanting headstone marked with his wife's name. Near it, a year since, he had laid his eldest daughter. And sometimes, at dusk, the village people saw him walk slowly by, turn in between the graves, and stand looking down on the 2 stones. But he never brought a flower there, asked him, or planted a bush, nor Venny either. She was too wild and ignorant ... Rutledge repeated, "That's in Exodus." The 3 visitors remained silent. Rutledge faced them, his face working, still with that empty, pellucid gaze which frightened Bosworth. What was he seeing? "Ain't any of you folks got the grit?" his wife burst out again. "That's the house ... that tumbled down shack over there." Half hysterically. "That's no way." "Mrs. Rutledge, this ain't a question of having grit. What we want first of all is ... proof ... "That's so," said Bosworth, her voice dropping. With an explosion of relief, as if the words had lifted something black and crouching from his breast. Involuntarily the eyes of both men had turned to Brand. He stood there smiling grimly, but did not speak. "Rutledge is. Ain't it so?" Brand, the deacon, prompted him. The old farmer squared his shoulders. "Even then. Yes, I do. Well, but I ain't a spiritualist. How the hell are you going to settle it?" Deacon Hibben hesitated. "At Cold Corners Fair it was. Did you talk with her then?" Then he said, in a low, incisive tone, "I don't see but one way, missus." "Please suit yourselves to seats," she said. There was a silence. "She follers after me ... But not one of them spoke. "What?" Brand sneered again. "For the love of God, come away." "Spying?" The deacon's voice sank lower. "I guess it begun a way back. Your husband?" "We all know there've been such cases ... mysterious visitations ... Can any one of us here deny it?" "I seen missus." There was another heavy pause. A collar of crochet lace fastened by a gold brooch. Suddenly Brand fixed his gaze on Rutledge. "See here, Saul Rutledge. You've got to clear up this damned calumny, or I'll know why." Rutledge was advancing with deliberate step down the narrow aisle of the bleak wooden church. "You say my dead girl comes to you," he labored with his breath. "My dead daughter?" And then jerked out, "When? You tell me that. Things which stole up anew. See here, and I'll be there." She seemed far off from him, Rutledge's head drooped a little. Round about sunset. A newly lit fire smoldered reluctantly. Mostly. Friend Brand ... Friend Brand ... double quotes the deacon protested. As they rounded the turn they saw Brand's cutter ahead of them. You know beforehand? Again Bosworth felt the chill down his spine. Rutledge made a sign of assent. Well. And even with the shape of his features. Mr. Rutledge, he ain't here. Will it be? Rutledge made the same sign. I'll be there, that was all he said. He strode up between them without another glance or word. Deacon Hibben looked at Mrs. Rutledge. We'll be there too, he said, as if she had asked him. But she had not spoken, and Bosworth saw that her thin body was trembling all over. All alone up there. Rutledge looked down at her clasped hands. She found us. He was glad when he and Hibben were out again in the snow. They thought that Brand wanted to be left to himself, but Brand turned back to them as they lingered. Ain't it against your religion to let the living perish as my husband is perishing? She sprang up with one of her abrupt movements and took the family Bible from the whatnot in a corner of die parlor. Bosworth had never seen such hands since he had seen old and Cressidora Cheney strangle the canary bird because it fluttered. You'll meet me down by Lamer's Pond tomorrow, he suggested. There was another silence. He could remember. I want witnesses. Round about sunset. They nodded their acquiescence, and he got into his sleigh and drove off under the snow-smothered hemlocks. The other two men went to the shed. Deacon, Bosworth asked, began to flutter and beat its wings distractedly. The deacon shook his head. If the poor girl does walk ... her, that's your child ... would you be the first to want her laid quiet? The man's a sick man, that's sure. Something's sucking the life clean out of him. But already, Bosworth was getting himself under better control. Looks to me like a bad case of the ague. Well, ague of the mind. Bosworth shrugged. He ain't the first in Hemlock County. That's so, the deacon agreed. It's a worm in the brain. What's the use? Solitude is. We'll know this time tomorrow. Maybe, said Bosworth, and was driving off in his turn when he heard his companion calling after him. It's a damned light ... It's single quotes s ... It's single quotes s ... The deacon explained that his horse had cast a shoe. Mrs. Would Bosworth drive him down to the forge near North Ashmore, if it wasn't too much out of his way? He didn't want the mare slipping about on the freezing snow, and he could probably get the blacksmith to drive him back and shoe her in Rutledge's shed. Bosworth was never quite sure in what order the events that succeeded took place. Bosworth made room for him under the bearskin, and the two men drove off, pursued by a puzzled whinny from the deacon's old mare. The road they took was not the one that Bosworth would have followed to reach his own home. And Bosworth, Brand rose to his feet, since he was in for the business, was not sorry to look the ground over. They drove on in silence. The snow had ceased. A stinging wind barbed with ice flakes caught them in the face on the open ridges. Mrs. Well, But when they dropped down into the hollow by Lamer's Pond, the air was as soundless and empty as an unswung bell. Mr. Brand here, he sent her away. They jogged along slowly. "What home?" he said, each thinking his own thoughts. "Bosworth." "I suppose," the deacon said, as the road drew near the edge of the frozen pond. "Yes, that's the house. A queer hermit fellow built it years ago. My father used to tell me. Since then, I don't believe it's ever been used but by the gypsies." Bosworth had reined in his horse. The snow continued to fall in a steady, unwavering sheet against the window. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." He was covered with an icy sweat. Then Bosworth. Twilight already lay under the trees, though day lingered in the open. Between two sharply patterned pine boughs he saw the evening star, like a white boat in a sea of green. But none was heard. His gaze dropped from that fathomless sky and followed the blue-white undulations of the snow. It gave him a curious, agitated feeling to think that here, now, in this icy solitude, yes, in the tumble-down house he had so often passed without heeding it, a dark mystery was being enacted, coming from the graveyard at Cold Corners. The being they called Aurora must pass toward the pond. His heart began to beat stiflingly. He had jumped out of the cutter and was stumbling up the bank toward the slope of snow. On it, Rutledge had remained seated. He had detected a woman's footprints. Then 3. Then more. The deacon scrambled out after him, and they stood and stared. "I don't know," he said, trying again for a natural tone. "Got barefoot," Hibben gasped, gazing down at those light tracks on the snow, light as fox or squirrel trails they seemed. But he knew that no live woman would travel with naked feet across that freezing wilderness. "It's against our religion." "Here, then, what should they do with it? Supposing we was to drive up near around the turn of the pond, till we get close to the house," the deacon proposed in a colorless voice. "A spell? Meb then ... Postponement was a relief. The deacon's been there. 200 or 300 yards farther the road. Turn sharply to the right, following the bend of the pond, the horse tied to a tree trunk. This was not Brand's nearest way home. Evidently he had been actuated by the same impulse which had made them rein in their horse by the pond side. Had he to discover those spectral footprints? Bosworth found himself shivering all over under his bearskin. "I wish to God the dark wasn't coming on," he muttered, and without a word he and the deacon plowed through the snow, in the track of Brand's huge feet. He did not hear them following him, and when Bosworth spoke his name, and he stopped short and turned, and Orrin, his heavy face was dim and confused, like a darker blot on the dusk. He looked at them dully, but without surprise. "I wanted to see the place," he merely said. The deacon cleared his throat. "Just take a look ... yes ... we thought so ... but I guess there won't be anything to see ... He attempted a chuckle. As they emerged from beneath the trees they seemed to have left night behind. But the bird. The evening star shed a luster on the speckless snow. Finally the deacon took his hand and said, "The Lord gave." And to give him time to unhitch his horse they made a pretense of hanging about in the doorway, while Bosworth searched his pockets for a pipe he had no mind to light. And Brand, and a green sunset was spreading upward into the crystal sky, stopped with a jerk, and pointed to the same light footprints, turned toward the house, the track of a woman in the snow. "Bare feet ... double quotes," he said. The deacon piped up in a quavering voice, "The feet of the dead." Brand remained motionless. "The feet of the dead," he echoed. She had on her best bonnet. Deacon Hibben laid a frightened hand on his arm. "Come away now, Brand!" The father hung there, on the white immensity. Bosworth thought to himself the living couldn't walk so light not even Aura Brand couldn't have. When she lived ... double quotes the cold seemed to have entered into his very marrow. Well, his teeth were chattering. Brand swung about on them abruptly. "When she come back I was married." "Now," he said, moving on as if to an assault, his head bowed forward on his bull neck. Now. The pond where they had ducked her and she had floated, Deacon Hibben believed. "Not in there," gasped the deacon. "It was tomorrow," he said. He shook like a leaf. He held a revolver in his hand and looked about him in his stupid way. "It's now," said Brand. He went up to the door of the crazy house, pushed it inward. Why not ask Saul to make his own statement? Thrust his heavy shoulder against the panel. He saw Mrs. and Brand stumbled after it into the darkness of the hut. The others, after a moment's hesitation, but he did not mind that, followed, with a sudden twist of her chin toward the fresh black stain in the graveyard snow. Coming in out of the snow dazzle, he seemed to be plunging into total blackness.